He just stood there in the pale moonlight, his face a mask of stone, the weathered lines around his eyes like canyons of old grief. My heart was a drum against my ribs, the cold weight of the shotgun in my hands feeling both necessary and absurd. I had imagined a monster, a kidnapper, some ghost haunting these woods, but the truth was something so much more human, and so much more devastating. He finally looked at me, his gaze hollow, and said the one thing I never, ever expected to hear. It's me. I'm the one who's been crying. This is a new channel with incredible stories every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It all started because of a lie. A lie I told myself for years. The lie was that I was a city person. I had a life that looked perfect on paper. A sleek apartment with a view of the skyline, a decent job in graphic design, a beautiful fiancée named Sarah. I thought I had it all. But the city was a grinder. The constant noise, the pressure, the feeling of being a single ant in a sprawling, indifferent colony, it was wearing me down. My creativity, the one thing I truly valued about myself, was drying up. It was being replaced by a low, humming anxiety that followed me everywhere. The breakup was the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't dramatic, no thrown plates or screaming matches. It was worse. It was quiet. A slow, agonizing decay of affection that ended with her saying, "I just don't think you're happy, and I can't make you happy." She was right. I wasn't happy. I was suffocating. So I ran. I cashed out a small inheritance my grandparents had left me, quit my job, and bought a small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains, a place so remote you couldn't even see it on Google Maps. It was a drastic move, maybe even a foolish one, but I felt like a drowning man kicking for the surface. I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think again. The cabin was exactly what I'd dreamed of. It was old, built from thick, dark logs that smelled of pine and earth and time. It had a stone fireplace, a rickety porch, and a view of nothing but an endless sea of green trees. The first few weeks were pure bliss. I felt my soul decompressing. The city's noise was replaced by the symphony of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chatter of squirrels, the distant hoot of an owl at dusk. I started writing again, not for a client, but for myself. A novel I'd been putting off for a decade. The words flowed out of me, fueled by the solitude and the gallons of black coffee I brewed on my wood-burning stove. I chopped wood. I fished in the nearby creek. I learned to identify birds by their calls. I was finally, truly alone. And I loved it. I thought I had found my sanctuary, my personal heaven. I had no idea it was about to become my own private hell. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it. It was late. Maybe 2 in the morning. A storm was rolling in, and the wind was howling through the pines, making the old cabin creak and groan like a tired old man. Amidst the sounds of the storm, I heard something else. A faint, high-pitched sound. It sounded almost like a cat, a pained meow carried on the wind. I rolled over in my bed, pulled the thick quilt over my head, and thought nothing more of it. Animals made strange noises in the woods. That's just how it was. The next night was clear and still. The sky was a black velvet blanket punctured by a million diamond-bright stars. The silence was absolute, almost holy. And then I heard it again. This time, there was no wind to blame it on. It was clearer, more distinct. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a child crying. My blood ran cold. It was a desperate, heartbreaking sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods, just beyond the edge of my property. I sat bolt upright in bed, my ears straining in the darkness. Who would be out here with a child in the middle of the night? We were miles from the nearest town. I had only one neighbor, an old man who lived about a mile down the unpaved track, and I'd only seen him once from a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The crying continued for another minute, a series of shuddering sobs, before fading away into nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. My peaceful sanctuary suddenly felt menacing, its isolation no longer a comfort but a threat. The next morning I decided to meet my neighbor. Maybe he knew something. His name was Elias, according to the old mailboxes at the start of the trek. His place was even more rustic than mine, a small, weathered shack with a plume of smoke curling from its chimney. He was outside, splitting firewood with a practiced, rhythmic swing of his axe. He was old, maybe in his late 70s, with a face as weathered as the bark on the trees around us. He looked up as I approached, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue, and he didn't smile. He just rested his axe and waited. I introduced myself, trying to sound casual, friendly. "Hey, I'm the new guy who moved into the old Miller cabin." He just grunted a non-committal, "Heard." I decided to just get to the point. "Look, this is gonna sound crazy," I began, "but I've been hearing something at night. It sounds like a child crying out in the woods." Elias didn't even blink. He wiped a sweaty hand on his trousers and stared off into the trees. "Bobcat," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They can sound like a screaming woman or a baby. Spooks the city folk every time." He said it with such finality, such dismissal, that I felt foolish. Of course. A bobcat. It made perfect sense. I thanked him, feeling a wave of relief wash over me, and headed back to my cabin. But as I walked away, I had the distinct, unnerving feeling that his pale blue eyes were watching me until I was completely out of sight. For a few nights I convinced myself he was right. I heard the sound again, but I told myself, "It's just a bobcat. It's just a bobcat." I tried to believe it. But the sound was just too human. It had a cadence of real sorrow, a pattern of inhalation and desperate sobs that no animal could replicate. The fear began to creep back in, colder and sharper this time. And then I found the doll. I was clearing some brush near the edge of my property, a few hundred yards from the cabin, when I saw it. Tucked into the roots of an ancient oak tree was a small, handmade doll. It was crudely stitched from scraps of burlap, with mismatched buttons for eyes and bits of dried yarn for hair. It was a child's toy, clearly. But it wasn't old. It was clean, as if it had been placed there recently. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't a bobcat. Someone was out here. Someone was watching me, leaving things. I snatched the doll and ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I placed it on the mantelpiece, and it just sat there, its button eyes staring at me with a blank, unsettling gaze. That's when the paranoia truly set in. My sanctuary became a prison. During the day, I was on edge, constantly scanning the tree line, feeling a prickle on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I was sure I saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of motion at the edge of my vision that was gone when I turned to look. A few times, I found footprints near my woodpile that weren't mine. They were small, almost like a child's, but they were faint, and I could never be sure. I stopped writing. The words wouldn't come. My mind was consumed by the crying, the doll, the feeling of being observed. I started sleeping with my grandfather's old shotgun propped against my nightstand. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, wide awake, listening. The crying would start, always around the same time, always from the same direction. It was a nightly torment. I started talking to myself, trying to reason it out. A lost child would have been found by now. A prankster would have gotten bored. This was something else, something persistent, something personal. What would you have done in my place? Just pack up and leave? Or try to figure it out? Let me know in the comments. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the rational explanation Elias had given me and the terrifying evidence of my own senses. The breaking point came after about 2 weeks of this psychological torture. I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I was either going crazy, or something was seriously wrong in these woods, and either way, I needed answers. I decided to go looking for the source of the crying. The next time it started, I wouldn't just lie there in fear. I would act. That night, right on schedule, the heartbreaking sobs drifted through the trees. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my most powerful flashlight, and, after a moment's hesitation, the shotgun. I didn't want to use it, but the thought of going out there unarmed was unthinkable. I stepped out onto my porch and into the pitch-black night. The air was cold and damp. The crying seemed louder out here, echoing in the oppressive silence of the forest. I took a deep breath and plunged into the trees, following the sound. The woods at night are a different world. Every snapped twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot. The beam of my flashlight cut a nervous, bouncing tunnel through the darkness, making shadows leap and dance like malevolent spirits. I pushed deeper, the sobs growing louder, more distinct. It felt like I was getting close. After about 15 minutes of walking, I stumbled into a small, hidden clearing, and in the center of it stood a shack. It was a dilapidated, forgotten thing, barely more than a pile of rotting wood. The roof had partially collapsed, and one of the windows was just a dark, gaping hole. It wasn't on any map. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but as my light panned across the front, it caught something. A set of fresh footprints in the mud leading to the door. My blood turned to ice. Someone was using this place. With my heart pounding, I pushed the creaking door open and shone my light inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay and damp earth. And something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like old perfume. The inside was a single, small room. There was a crumbling cot in the corner, a broken chair, and not much else. But the walls were covered in children's drawings. They were tacked up everywhere, dozens of them, drawn in crayon on yellowed, brittle paper, simple, innocent drawings. A smiling sun with stick arms. A lopsided house with a curl of smoke coming from the chimney. A stick-figure family, a man, a woman, and a little girl in a red dress holding hands. My light lingered on the drawing of the girl. She had bright yellow yarn-like hair, just like the doll. A wave of nausea and profound sadness washed over me. This was a child's secret playhouse. But who was she? And what happened here? I scanned the room again, and my flashlight beam landed on a small, modern-looking electronic device tucked away under the cot. It was a small speaker, the kind you'd connect to a phone, with a wire leading out through a hole in the back wall. It was all a trick. A recording. The crying wasn't a ghost. It wasn't even a person out here in the woods. It was coming from this speaker. The relief was immediately replaced by a surge of cold anger. Who would do this? Who would torment someone with such a cruel, elaborate hoax? And why? There was only one person who could be responsible. Elias. I didn't even think. I just saw red. I stormed out of that shack, leaving the crying to echo behind me, and marched through the woods towards Elias's property. The anger burned away my fear. All the sleepless nights, the paranoia, the terror. It was all his fault. He had lied to my face. Bobcat, he'd said. He knew. He knew the whole time. When I reached his cabin, the lights were on. I could see his silhouette moving inside. I didn't knock. I burst through the door, my shotgun held ready but pointed at the floor. He was standing by his stove, and he turned, startled. He saw the fury in my face, the gun in my hands, and his own expression hardened. "What is the meaning of this?" he rasped. "The crying," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "The shack, the speaker, the drawings. It's you. It's all you. Why? Why would you do this?" I expected him to deny it, to get angry, to threaten me. But he didn't. He just sighed. It was a sound of immense, bottomless weariness, the sound of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for a very long time. He looked from my face to the shotgun and then back again. His shoulders slumped. And that's when he said it. "It's me. I'm the one who's been crying." I just stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about? It's a recording of a little girl." He sank into a wooden chair by his table, his face buried in his gnarled hands. The story came out of him in broken pieces, a confession torn from the depths of his soul. His daughter. Her name was Lily. She was his whole world after his wife passed away. She loved these woods more than anything. The little shack in the clearing was her castle, her secret hideout where she would draw for hours. The drawings I saw were hers, The doll, he'd made it for her, just like the ones he used to make for her when she was little. He would leave them in her favorite spots as a game. He told me that 10 years ago, when she was just 7 years old, there was a terrible accident. A storm, much like the one on my first night here, had blown in suddenly. A tree branch, weakened by rot, had snapped and fallen. She had been playing near her castle. She died instantly. Elias's world ended that day. The silence in his cabin, once filled with her laughter, became a suffocating monster. He couldn't bear it. He was a retired audio engineer, a hobbyist who loved to tinker with electronics. One day, in his grief-stricken madness, he dug out old home movies, old cassette tapes he'd made of her. He carefully extracted the sounds of her laughter, her singing, her little frustrated cries when a drawing didn't turn out right. He edited them together, creating a loop, and set up the speaker in her old playhouse. It was his way of making the woods feel less empty. It was his way of pretending she was still out there, just playing in her castle. He wasn't trying to scare me. He told me he barely even noticed I'd moved in. He was so lost in his own world of grief, his ritual had become automatic. The crying wasn't for me, it was for him. It was the sound of his own broken heart, echoing through the trees. The crying I heard was a mix of her actual crying from when she was a toddler. But most of it was him, a lonely old man, sobbing into a recorder in the dead of night, his grief so profound he couldn't even voice it himself anymore, so he let her ghostly echo do it for him. He was a ghost, haunted by a memory. I stood there in the middle of his small, warm cabin, the shotgun feeling like a ton of lead in my hands. My anger had evaporated, replaced by a wave of shame and a profound, aching sadness that settled deep in my bones. I had been so wrapped up in my own fear, my own story, that I had imagined a monster. But there was no monster here. There was only a father, broken by a loss so immense I couldn't even begin to comprehend it. I slowly, carefully, unloaded the shotgun and leaned it against the wall. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt so small, so inadequate. So I just sat down at the table across from him, and for the first time, two lonely men sat in the quiet of the woods, sharing a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a terrible, unspoken understanding. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're finding this story as intense as I did living it, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know and ensures you won't miss what's coming. I left his cabin that night and walked back to my own under the brilliant starlight. The woods were no longer menacing. They just felt sad. The trees seemed to bow their heads in mourning. When I got back, I took the little burlap doll from the mantelpiece and held it in my hands. I saw it differently now. It wasn't a threat. It was a prayer. A message of love left for a ghost. That night, for the first time in weeks, the woods were completely silent. The crying had stopped, and it never came back. I didn't see Elias for a few days after that. I was worried, but I also felt like he needed his space. Then, one morning, I opened my door to find a small loaf of freshly baked bread sitting on my porch rail, still warm. There was no note. None was needed. A few weeks later, I left a copy of the first draft of my novel on his porch. We never spoke of that night again. We didn't have to. An unspoken truce, a bond of shared solitude, had formed between us. We'd occasionally nod to each other from a distance when I was out walking, or he was chopping wood. It was enough. I finished my novel that winter. The experience had changed me, and it had changed my story. It became a book not about running away, but about the things we run from, and the hidden griefs that people carry inside them. The city hadn't been the problem. My own inability to face my unhappiness was. And here, in the heart of a silence I once craved, I had been confronted by a sorrow so much deeper than my own. It put everything into perspective. I learned that sometimes, the things that scare us the most are not monsters in the dark, but the deep, unimaginable pain of another human heart. Did I do the right thing by confronting him? Or should I have just called the authorities from the start, thinking there was a child in danger? It's a question that still bothers me sometimes. Have you ever completely misjudged a situation, only to find a heartbreaking truth behind it? I'm still living in the cabin. It's my home now. The woods are quiet, and the silence is peaceful again. But it's a different kind of peace. It's a quiet that is earned, one that understands the depth of what can be lost, and what can be found, in the most isolated corners of the world. Share your thoughts or theories in the comments. I read every single one.